This episode was made possible thanks to generous supporters on Patreon. This is the 5th part of the mini-series that I'm making about the so-called luxury chords. So if you haven't watched the previous parts, you can do so on the links down in the description. In the previous episodes, I addressed the numbered chords that look so intimidating, and I hope that my insights that I shared with you helped you to understand them better and made them at least a bit clearer. As I said, there are some more categories of chords, and one of them is the topic of today's video, and it's slash chords. Of course, these chords are the chords that Slash plays. I'm joking, obviously. The term slash chords comes from the idea of how these chords are notated. And, normally when you have a chord, the bass note is usually the root of the chord, but when it's not, we do that thing. This means that we've got the chord, and after the slash, we've got the bass note, which is indicated as something that's different from the root. In this particular case, it's A major over C sharp, which means A major with C sharp in the bass. The slash chords are used much more often than you probably think, and quite frequently guitarists aren't even aware of their existence because when you play in a band, it's usually the bass player who's in charge of that. However, once you decide to play a song solo that has a lot of these chords, it just doesn't sound right if you play them all like ordinary chords. The reason is that once you change the bass note of the chord, it affects the chord in such a way that's comparable to what happens when you start adding sevenths, ninths, and so forth. And for the sake of easier understanding, I've divided them into 2 separate categories. The first one is the triad bass chords, and the other one is non-triad bass chords. Triad bass notes are the notes that are part of the basic chord, and the basic chord consists of 3 notes, which we call the triad. And these are the notes that are most commonly used and usually are the most consonant. Normally the bass note is the same as the root of the chord. And these are the cases with all of these chords from the gauge system that you probably know, and if you don't know what gauge system is, I will make a future video about that. However, sometimes when we play songs like this, it just won't sound right if they're played like this. The second one just sounds lame.
Much to learn. You still have.
The difference is that the original contains a lot of these slash chords that give so beautiful flow of the track. This song is also a very good example of the most commonly used type of slash chords, which are the chords that have the 3rd degree in the bass. Generally, the higher we go on the chord structure, the more unstable notes we get, and this also affects which note we will put in the bass. So from this perspective, a chord that has 3rd degree in the bass would sound less stable than the same chord with the root in the bass. And following the same logic, we can assume that having the fifth degree in the bass will sound even more stable, and this assumption is quite correct. And even this type of chords is being used in classical music, and it's called the cadential 6/4 chord, and essentially it's something that precedes the dominant chord in a cadence like that. You can see that this chord, even though it's tonic with the fifth in the bass, it still sounds quite unstable, and somehow it's pulling towards the dominant. And this is a very good illustration of what happens with this particular type of chord. Now let's get into a little bit more detail about how to build these slash chords with third degree in the bass. What's important to note about this particular variation is that it's not a good idea to double the bass note in the chord, because it creates the impression that this is not A major with C sharp in the bass, but rather C sharp minor with sharp 5 on top. And this is why in the classical theory it's even not recommended to do this particular voicing. And the solution of this problem is to use a voicing that's rather what we call power chord. So it's root, fifth, and another root on top, and then we just add the bass note on the bottom. And I think this voicing sounds much better than this one. Now, probably you're even familiar with this type of sound, because if we slide this down a whole step, we get this thing, and I'm sure that you've encountered this at least once. So, we take this, and we know that the third degree is what defines whether the chord is major or minor. So if we want a minor chord, we just move the third degree half step down, and we get A minor with C in the bass. And you can apply this logic and do these chords everywhere on the neck. Power chord, bass note, power chord, bass note, power chord, bass note. When it comes to slash chords with fifth degree in the bass, we need to follow another acoustic principle, and that's that if we have the fifth degree in the bass and then we put the root just below that, thus forming the interval of perfect fourth, the harmonics of these two notes blend so much together that it creates this phenomenon which I call the illusory seventh string. And this is when you play chords like that. And these two notes, they create the illusion that there is even lower root below that. So this almost sounds like that. And this is the psychoacoustic reason why it's not a good idea to put the root below the fifth when the fifth is in the bass. And the solution of this thing is just to skip the root and just continue with the chords upwards. And since the fifth is the same regardless of the chord being major or minor, you can just use the same principle for both major and minor chords. Now let's move to the non-triad bass notes. Usually these are the seventh degree of the chords, and this will give even more instability than the fifth. We can see how this chord works in the same example with the song by Chicago, where we have C sharp minor with B in the bass. First we've got the C sharp minor, which is stable because it's the relative tonic of the song, and then we change the bass to B, and suddenly it gets unstable and wants to go somewhere. Another good example is my favorite song by Elton John. We can see that here again we've got the tonic, where we've got stability, and then change the bass note to the 7th degree, and we get the same type of effect. This chord wants to move somewhere else. Technically, you can continue changing the bass note with the other chord notes. So, for example, you can go for the 9th, and in the situation with A major, it will be B. But this is kind of useless because it already sounds like an 11th chord. In this particular case, B11. So this one is not very useful. If you continue upwards with the 11th, from the perspective of A major, it will be D. So we put D here and we play the A major triad. And this actually sounds like D major 9. So again, not really useless. And if we put the 13th, which in A major is F sharp, this is actually F sharp minor 7. So really there is no much sense to use anything beyond the 7, but you can experiment with some dissonant stuff, and experimenting is the best way to learn. So that's everything for today's episode, and I hope you find it useful. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below which of these slash chords you like the most and why. And if you like my work, consider supporting me on Patreon on the links down in the description, where you can get a lot of interesting things like tabs, audio downloads, exclusive materials, and so forth. And the membership starts as low as $3 per month. And if you prefer to support me by a single donation, you can do so on the PayPal me link below. And if you're a first-time viewer, please subscribe to my channel and click that bell notification button to get informed when I upload new video. See you next time, and remember, practice makes perfect.